The rain hammered against the warehouse windows like bullets, but inside, the silence was deafening. Sarah Martinez stood perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides, as 12 Navy SEALs formed a tight circle around her. Their tactical gear gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, their weapons trained on the woman who looked more like a college professor than a threat. But appearances, as they were about to learn, could be deadlier than any weapon in their arsenal. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the team leader said, his voice steady but cautious. "There's been a misunderstanding." Sarah's lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "The only misunderstanding here is yours." Her voice carried the weight of authority that made grown men pause. "I told you, I'm a Marine combat master." What happened in the next 2 seconds would become legend in military circles. What followed would change everything they thought they knew about warfare, loyalty, and the price of underestimating the quiet ones. This is the story of how one woman's past caught up with the present, and how the deadliest warriors in the world learned that some battles are won before the first shot is ever fired. Sarah Martinez had been living the quiet life for 3 years now. Every morning at 6 sharp, she would jog through the peaceful streets of Cedar Falls, a small town in Oregon where the biggest excitement was usually the annual pumpkin festival. Her neighbors knew her as the friendly librarian who always had time to help kids with their homework and who made the best chocolate chip cookies for the community bake sales. The public library where Sarah worked was her sanctuary. Surrounded by thousands of books, she found peace in the silence between the pages. Children would gather around her during story time, their eyes wide with wonder as she brought fairy tales to life with voices and gestures that seemed almost magical. Parents trusted her completely, often leaving their kids in her care while they ran errands. To everyone in Cedar Falls, Sarah Martinez was the epitome of small-town kindness. But late at night, when the town slept peacefully, Sarah would sometimes stand at her bedroom window, looking out at the dark forest that bordered the town. In those quiet moments, her posture would change. Her soft librarian shoulders would straighten into the rigid bearing of a soldier. Her gentle eyes would scan the tree line with the intensity of someone who had seen real darkness and knew it could return at any moment. Sarah's small cottage was decorated with flowers and cozy furniture, but hidden beneath the floorboards of her basement lay something that would have shocked her neighbors. Military gear, weapons, and documents that told a very different story about who Sarah Martinez really was. She had hoped never to touch those items again, but she kept them clean and ready just in case. The transformation from her real identity to this peaceful librarian hadn't been easy. 3 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Martinez, one of the most decorated Marine combat masters in military history. She had led missions in places most people couldn't pronounce, made decisions that saved thousands of lives, and earned the respect of every branch of the military. But she had also seen things that haunted her dreams and made choices that weighed heavily on her conscience. After her last mission, Sarah had requested an honorable discharge. The military tried to convince her to stay, offering promotions and prestigious assignments, but she was done. She wanted a normal life, away from the violence and constant danger. The government had agreed to let her disappear into civilian life, with a new identity and a promise that her past would remain buried. Cedar Falls had been the perfect choice for her new life. It was far from any military bases, small enough that everyone knew everyone, and peaceful enough that the most dangerous thing that happened was teenagers stealing traffic cones as pranks. Sarah had bought her cottage with cash, created a believable backstory about being a teacher from California who wanted a quieter life, and slowly became part of the community. The library job had been perfect. It required a college degree, which Sarah had earned before joining the Marines, and it allowed her to help people in a way that didn't involve weapons or violence. She genuinely loved working with the children, teaching them to love reading the same way she had as a child. Their innocent questions and bright smiles reminded her why she had fought so hard to protect the world they would inherit. Sarah had even started dating again. Tom Bradley was a local mechanic who fixed her car and made her laugh with his terrible jokes. He was kind, honest, and completely unaware that the woman he was falling in love with could disable him in 12 different ways without breaking a sweat. Their relationship was slow and sweet, built on long conversations over coffee and quiet walks through the town park. But even in this peaceful existence, Sarah remained vigilant. Her military training was too deeply ingrained to simply disappear. She noticed when strangers came to town, memorized the license plates of unusual vehicles, and always sat with her back to the wall in restaurants. She told herself it was just habit, that she was being paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her past might someday catch up with her. That feeling proved to be prophetic on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Sarah was closing the library, turning off lights, and checking that all the books had been properly shelved when she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It hadn't been there when she arrived that morning, and something about it made her skin crawl. The windows were too dark, the license plate was from out of state, and it had been sitting in the same spot for hours without anyone getting in or out. Sarah finished her closing routine as normal, but her senses were on high alert. She said goodbye to Mrs. Henderson, who was returning books, and waved to Joey Peterson, who was riding his bicycle home from soccer practice. Everything seemed normal, but the SUV remained, its engine running softly in the growing darkness. Instead of walking directly to her car, Sarah took a detour through the children's section, moving between the tall shelves in a pattern that would make it difficult for anyone watching to predict her movements. She used the reflective surface of the computer screens to observe the parking lot, and what she saw confirmed her worst fears. 2 more vehicles had arrived while she was inside, positioning themselves to block the most obvious escape routes. Sarah's heart rate increased, but her mind remained calm. Years of training kicked in automatically, and she began calculating distances, identifying potential weapons, and planning multiple escape routes. She moved to the back of the library, where a fire exit led to an alley that most people in town had forgotten existed. If she could reach her car without being spotted, she might be able to get home and retrieve her emergency supplies before whatever was coming arrived in full force. But as Sarah pushed open the fire exit, she found herself face to face with 3 men in tactical gear. They were professionals, that much was clear from their stance and equipment, but they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed that a small-town librarian would be easy to handle, that she would panic or comply without resistance. The first man reached for her arm, probably intending to guide her quietly to one of the waiting vehicles. Sarah allowed him to make contact, then grabbed his wrist and twisted it in a way that sent him to his knees instantly. The second man reached for his weapon, but Sarah was already moving, using the first man's body as leverage to deliver a kick that sent the second man sprawling into the brick wall of the building. The third man was smarter. Instead of trying to grab her, he pulled out a taser and aimed it at Sarah's center mass. But Sarah had been expecting that. She rolled behind a dumpster as the electroprongs sparked against the metal, then came up with a piece of broken concrete in her hand. Her throw was perfectly aimed, striking the man's hand and sending his weapon clattering across the alley. In less than 30 seconds, 3 trained operatives were on the ground, and Sarah was running through the maze of alleys that crisscrossed the old part of Cedar Falls. She knew these streets better than any GPS system, having jogged through them hundreds of times over the past 3 years. More importantly, she knew where the blind spots were, where security cameras couldn't see, and how to move without making sound on the wet pavement. Sarah reached her cottage 15 minutes later, approaching from the back through the forest that she had spent so many nights staring into. Her house was dark, which was good, but there were fresh tire tracks in the soft earth around her property, which was very bad. Someone had been here, probably searching the place while she was dealing with the team at the library. She didn't go inside through the front door. Instead, Sarah climbed onto her roof using a route she had practiced dozens of times, then dropped through the skylight she had modified when she first moved in. The house was empty, but it had definitely been searched. Her furniture was slightly out of place, her books had been moved, and there was a faint smell of cologne that didn't belong. Sarah wasted no time. She went straight to the basement, pulled up the loose floorboards, and began retrieving her equipment. The military gear was exactly as she had left it, clean and ready for use. She changed out of her librarian clothes and into black tactical pants, boots, and a fitted shirt that wouldn't restrict her movement. The transformation was remarkable, like watching a butterfly turn back into a caterpillar, except this caterpillar was deadly. Her weapons were next. Sarah strapped on a tactical vest, loaded with ammunition and various tools that she hoped she wouldn't need, but knew she probably would. She holstered a pistol on her right hip, a backup weapon on her left ankle, and several knives in locations that would be accessible but concealed. Finally, she grabbed a small backpack containing emergency supplies, fake identification documents, and enough cash to disappear for months if necessary. As Sarah prepared to leave her sanctuary forever, she allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she was leaving behind. She thought about the children who would wonder where their favorite librarian had gone, about Tom and the date they had planned for the weekend, about the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings that had healed her wounded soul. But that life was over now, ended by whoever had decided that Sarah Martinez couldn't be allowed to remain hidden. Sarah left through the same skylight she had entered, but this time she didn't head for the forest. Instead, she made her way toward the old warehouse district on the edge of town, where she could find shelter and begin planning her next move. She needed to figure out who was hunting her and why, and she needed to do it before they found her again. The warehouse she chose was one she had scouted months after moving to Cedar Falls, back when paranoia was stronger than hope. It was abandoned but structurally sound, with multiple entrances and exits, and a clear view of anyone approaching from any direction. More importantly, it was the last place anyone would expect a librarian to go. Sarah set up a defensive position on the second floor, where she could observe the street while remaining hidden in the shadows. She used her phone to access encrypted military channels she had hoped never to use again, trying to find out what kind of operation was being run against her and why. The answers she found were not encouraging. According to the limited information she could access, someone very high up in the government had classified her as a security risk. The exact reasons were blacked out, but the implications were clear. They wanted her back, either as an asset or as a liability to be eliminated. The team that had tried to take her at the library was just the beginning. Sarah turned off her phone and removed the battery, knowing that it could be used to track her location. She would have to assume that every piece of technology in her old life was compromised, that every friend and acquaintance was potentially under surveillance. The isolation was complete, just like it had been during her worst missions overseas. As the night deepened and rain continued to fall against the warehouse windows, Sarah settled in to wait. She knew they would come looking for her, probably with more resources and better intelligence about her capabilities. But she also knew something they didn't seem to understand. They weren't dealing with a retired soldier who had gone soft during 3 years of civilian life. They were dealing with Captain Sarah Martinez, Marine Combat Master, and she had just been reminded why she had earned that title in the first place. The quiet librarian was gone, buried along with her peaceful cottage and her dreams of a normal life. What remained was a warrior who had survived impossible missions and defeated enemies that other soldiers couldn't even imagine. Sarah checked her weapons one final time and settled into a meditation pose that would allow her to rest while remaining alert for any sounds of approach. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was alive, free, and angry. Her enemies had made a crucial mistake by forcing her back into this life. They were about to learn just how dangerous that mistake had been. Dawn broke gray and cold over Cedar Falls, but Sarah Martinez had been awake for hours. She had learned long ago that the period just after sunrise was when most people were least alert, making it the perfect time for reconnaissance missions. From her position in the abandoned warehouse, she watched as the town slowly came to life. But what she saw made her stomach clench with worry. The black SUVs were still there, now joined by additional vehicles that screamed federal operation. Unmarked vans, sedans with government plates, and even what looked like a mobile command center had taken up positions throughout the small town. Sarah counted at least 30 operatives, all armed, all professional, all focused on finding one woman who had dared to disappear. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see agents questioning her neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had borrowed romance novels every week, was talking to 2 men in suits on her front porch. She looked confused and frightened, probably wondering why federal agents were asking about the nice librarian who had helped her grandson with his reading homework. Sarah felt a stab of guilt, knowing that her presence had brought this chaos into their peaceful lives. Tom Bradley was being questioned next to his garage, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders even from a distance. He kept shaking his head and gesturing with his hands, probably telling them that Sarah couldn't possibly be involved in anything dangerous. If only he knew that the woman he had been dating could kill a man with a paperclip and had once infiltrated a terrorist stronghold using nothing but improvised explosives and pure determination. Sarah forced herself to look away from Tom. She couldn't afford emotional distractions now, not when every decision could mean the difference between freedom and capture. She needed to understand what kind of operation was being run against her and who was behind it. More importantly, she needed to find a way out of Cedar Falls before the net tightened completely. Using a secure military frequency that she had memorized but hoped never to use, Sarah began monitoring the communications between the teams searching for her. What she heard confirmed her worst fears and added new complications she hadn't expected. The operation was being run by Colonel James Morrison, a man Sarah knew by reputation and disliked intensely. Morrison was ambitious, ruthless, and completely willing to sacrifice soldiers for political gain. If he was involved, it meant that someone very powerful wanted Sarah back, and they didn't particularly care whether she came back alive or dead. But the most disturbing information came from intercepted conversations between Morrison and his superiors. They weren't just looking for Sarah because of something she had done. They needed her for a new mission, something so dangerous that they were willing to blow her cover and destroy her civilian life to get her back. The mission involved a terrorist cell that had acquired military-grade weapons and was planning an attack that could kill thousands of innocent people. Sarah listened to the details with growing horror. The terrorist group had specifically requested her by name, claiming they would only negotiate with Captain Sarah Martinez. They had somehow learned about her real identity and her location, then used that information to force the government's hand. If Sarah didn't participate in the mission, the terrorists would proceed with their attack. If she did participate, she would be walking into an obvious trap. The whole situation felt wrong to Sarah. Her real identity was known to fewer than a dozen people, all of them with the highest security clearances and unquestionable loyalty to the country. The fact that terrorists had accessed this information suggested either a massive security breach or a deliberate leak. Either way, Sarah was being manipulated, and she didn't like it. As the morning progressed, the search teams began expanding their coverage area. Sarah watched them work through her binoculars, noting their tactics and looking for weaknesses she could exploit. They were good, she had to admit. They moved in coordinated patterns, communicated effectively, and showed the kind of discipline that came from years of training. But they had one significant disadvantage. They were looking for a civilian, trying to hide from them. Sarah wasn't hiding. She was hunting. Every military operation had a command structure, and Sarah knew that taking out the leadership would create chaos in the ranks. Morrison would be coordinating from a secure location, probably the mobile command center she had spotted near the town square. If she could get to him, she might be able to negotiate a solution that didn't involve innocent people getting hurt. But first, she needed to gather more intelligence about the forces arrayed against her. Sarah left the warehouse through a hidden exit she had identified the night before, moving through the industrial district like a ghost. Her destination was the water treatment plant on the outskirts of town, a facility with utility tunnels that connected to the main sewer system. It wasn't glamorous, but it would allow her to move beneath the town without being detected. The tunnel system was exactly as Sarah had remembered from her initial reconnaissance of Cedar Falls 3 years ago. She had explored every inch of the underground infrastructure, just as she had mapped every building, road, and potential hiding spot in the area. What had seemed like paranoia at the time now proved to be excellent preparation. Moving through the tunnels, Sarah could hear footsteps and voices above her as search teams swept through buildings. They were being thorough, checking every possible hiding place, but they were also making noise and following predictable patterns. Sarah used their voices to track their movements, staying always one step ahead of their search perimeters. Her first stop was the basement of the police station, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that the local authorities probably didn't even know existed. Sarah needed to understand what kind of cooperation Morrison had secured from local law enforcement and whether the police chief was aware of the real situation. What she found was both encouraging and disturbing. Chief Patterson, a good man who had been protecting Cedar Falls for over 20 years, was clearly unhappy with the federal presence in his town. Sarah could see him through the building's ventilation system, arguing with a federal agent about jurisdiction and proper procedures. Patterson didn't know why the feds were looking for Sarah, but he knew his town and his people, and he didn't like strangers with guns disrupting the peace. Sarah considered approaching Patterson directly. He was a veteran who understood the difference between right and wrong, and he might be willing to help her if she could convince him of the truth. But doing so would put him in an impossible position, caught between federal authority and local loyalty. She decided to keep Patterson as a potential ally while exploring other options first. Her next stop was the communications hub that Morrison had established in the old fire station. Sarah needed to understand the full scope of the operation and identify any weaknesses she could exploit. The approach required her to cross 2 blocks of open ground where search teams were actively patrolling, but Sarah's training served her well. She moved during shift changes when guards were distracted by handoff procedures. She used the early morning shadows and her knowledge of the town's layout to avoid detection. Most importantly, she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, understanding that suspicious behavior was more likely to draw attention than calm competence. The fire station was heavily guarded, but the guards were focused on preventing entry through obvious routes. They weren't expecting someone to approach through the old coal chute that connected to the basement. Sarah had discovered this entrance during her initial exploration of the town, when she was learning about every building that might be useful in an emergency. From her position in the basement, Sarah could hear conversations happening on the floor above. Morrison was coordinating with multiple teams, adjusting search patterns based on real-time intelligence. But what caught Sarah's attention was a phone conversation between Morrison and someone who was clearly his superior. The voice on the other end of the line was giving Morrison a deadline. If Sarah wasn't captured within 24 hours, they would proceed with alternative plans. These alternatives included leveling her cottage with explosives, interrogating every person she had contact with in Cedar Falls, and declaring her a domestic terrorist who could be eliminated on sight. Sarah felt cold fury building in her chest. They were threatening innocent people to get to her, turning her neighbors into leverage and her friends into potential casualties. The people of Cedar Falls didn't deserve to be caught in this conflict. They had done nothing wrong except provide a safe haven for a woman trying to find peace. But the conversation also revealed useful information. Morrison's superior was clearly under pressure from someone even higher up the chain of command. This wasn't just about bringing Sarah in for a mission. This was about a political situation that required her participation, and the people in charge were running out of time and patience. Sarah retreated from the fire station with new intelligence and a growing understanding of the forces arrayed against her. She made her way back through the tunnel system, but instead of returning to the warehouse, she headed toward the town's main library. She had left something there that she now needed, and she suspected that Morrison's teams wouldn't expect her to return to such an obvious location. The library was under surveillance, but the agents were positioned to watch for someone entering through normal routes. They weren't expecting someone who knew every inch of the building, including the old book return chute that connected to the basement. Sarah had modified this chute slightly during her years working there, creating a hidden access point that even the building's maintenance staff didn't know about. Inside the library, Sarah moved through familiar spaces that now felt strange and dangerous. The children's section where she had read stories seemed like a different world, one where her biggest concern had been keeping young minds engaged with books instead of video games. Now she was creeping through the same space in tactical gear, retrieving emergency supplies she had hidden months ago. Sarah's destination was a loose floorboard beneath the reference desk, where she had concealed additional identification documents, money, and a special communication device that could contact certain individuals who owed her favors. The device was a last resort, something she had hoped never to use, but recent developments had changed her priorities. As Sarah retrieved her hidden supplies, she heard footsteps on the floor above. A search team had entered the library, probably doing a routine sweep of all buildings in their assigned sector. Sarah froze, listening to their movements and calculating the time she would need to reach an exit before they decided to check the basement. The team was professional, but not particularly imaginative. They cleared each room methodically, checking obvious hiding spots, but not looking for the kind of concealed entrances that Sarah had learned to create during her military career. They spent 15 minutes in the building before declaring it secure and moving on to their next target. Sarah waited an additional 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding spot. She now had everything she needed to begin the next phase of her plan, but she also had new information about the timeline she was working with. Morrison's 24-hour deadline meant she had less than 18 hours before the situation escalated to a level that would endanger everyone in Cedar Falls. Returning to the warehouse through the tunnel system, Sarah began planning her next move. She could continue running, using her skills and resources to stay ahead of the search teams until they gave up or were recalled. But running wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Morrison and his superiors would simply find another way to pressure her into compliance, and innocent people would continue to be at risk. The other option was to take control of the situation by going on the offensive. If Sarah could capture Morrison and force him to reveal who was really behind this operation, she might be able to negotiate a solution that protected the people of Cedar Falls while addressing whatever crisis had made her participation so essential. It was a dangerous plan that would require perfect execution and a significant amount of luck. Sarah would be outnumbered by experienced operatives who were specifically hunting for her. But she had advantages they didn't fully appreciate. She knew the terrain, she understood their tactics, and, most importantly, she was fighting for something more important than orders or career advancement. She was fighting for the right to choose her own life, for the safety of innocent people who had shown her kindness, and for the principle that some things were more important than political convenience. These motivations gave her an edge that no amount of training or equipment could provide. As evening approached, and search teams began adjusting their patterns for nighttime operations, Sarah Martinez prepared for the most important battle of her military career. Tomorrow, everyone involved would learn why she had earned the title of Marine Combat Master and why underestimating her had been their first and most critical mistake. The pre-dawn darkness of Cedar Falls was about to become a battlefield, though most of the town's residents slept peacefully, unaware that their quiet streets were crawling with federal operatives. Sarah Martinez had spent the night transforming from a hunted fugitive into a precision instrument of warfare. Every piece of equipment had been checked and rechecked, every contingency planned for, every possible outcome calculated. From her observation post in the warehouse, Sarah had identified the patterns of the search teams, the locations of their equipment, and, most importantly, the schedule of Colonel Morrison's movements. The man was arrogant enough to follow a predictable routine, visiting each team leader at specific intervals to receive updates and issue new orders. That predictability would be his downfall. Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of continuing to run or hide, she would strike at the heart of the operation by capturing Morrison himself. With the colonel in her custody, she could force him to reveal who had ordered this operation and why her participation in the mysterious mission was so critical. More importantly, she could negotiate the safety of Cedar Falls residents, who had become unwilling pawns in a game they didn't understand. At 4 a.m, when human alertness was naturally at its lowest point, Sarah began her approach to the mobile command center. The vehicle was parked in the town square, surrounded by a perimeter of guards who were focused on watching for threats from outside their circle. They weren't expecting an attack from someone who could move through their defensive positions like smoke through a screen door. Sarah's first objective was the communications array that Morrison used to coordinate with his teams. If she could disable their communications without triggering alarms, she would create confusion that would work to her advantage. The array was mounted on top of the command vehicle, protected by sophisticated security systems that would detect any tampering. But Sarah hadn't survived impossible missions by accepting that something couldn't be done. She had learned to find weaknesses that others missed, to exploit the gaps between what security systems were designed to protect against and what actually needed to be protected. The communications array was electronic, which meant it was vulnerable to electromagnetic interference if applied in exactly the right way. Moving through shadows that seemed to bend around her train form, Sarah approached the command vehicle from the blind spot created by its own bulk. She carried a device that looked like an oversized television remote, but was actually a military-grade electromagnetic pulse generator, designed to disable electronics without causing the kind of dramatic sparks and explosions that would alert every guard in the area. Sarah activated the device at precisely the right moment, sending a focused pulse of electromagnetic energy directly into the communications array. The effect was immediate but subtle. Screens flickered and went dark, radio transmissions cut to static, and the sophisticated computer systems that Morrison relied on to coordinate his operation simply died. Inside the command vehicle, Sarah could hear voices raised in confusion and frustration. Technicians scrambled to identify the problem, while Morrison demanded immediate solutions to restore communications. The chaos provided perfect cover for the next phase of Sarah's plan. While the guards were distracted by the communications failure, Sarah moved to disable the vehicles that Morrison's teams were using for transportation. She didn't destroy them, which would have created noise and obvious signs of sabotage. Instead, she used techniques learned in advanced demolitions training to disable critical components in ways that would cause the vehicles to fail when their operators tried to start them. A few drops of sand in the right locations, a carefully loosened bolt here and there, and several small cuts in fuel lines that would cause leaks, but not immediate failure. By the time Morrison's teams tried to respond to whatever was about to happen next, they would find themselves stranded and unable to coordinate effectively. Sarah's final preparation was the most dangerous. She needed to create a situation that would force Morrison to expose himself, to leave the security of his command vehicle, and move to a location where she could capture him without endangering innocent civilians. The solution required her to take a significant risk, but it was the only way to achieve her objectives. Using her knowledge of the town's infrastructure, Sarah made her way to the electrical substation that provided power to the government buildings where Morrison had established his operation. The substation was guarded, but the guards were focused on preventing sabotage to the power grid itself. They weren't watching for someone who understood exactly which circuits controlled which buildings. Sarah didn't cut the power to the entire town, which would have created panic and potentially dangerous situations for civilians. Instead, she carefully isolated the circuits that supplied Morrison's operation, creating a targeted blackout that would force him to investigate while leaving the rest of Cedar Falls unaffected. The effect was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Within minutes of the power failure, she could see flashlights moving through the darkened government buildings as Morrison's teams tried to understand what had gone wrong. More importantly, she could see Morrison himself leaving the command vehicle, surrounded by a security detail, but moving toward the power substation to personally assess the situation. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for. As Morrison and his security detail approached the substation, they entered a kill zone that Sarah had been observing and planning for hours. She knew every sight line, every piece of cover, every possible escape route. They were walking into her world now, where her training and experience gave her overwhelming advantages. Sarah struck with the precision and speed that had made her legendary among special operations forces. Her first target was the communications specialist who was trying to coordinate with other teams using a handheld radio. A precise throw from Sarah's position sent a small stone that struck the radio perfectly, shattering it into useless pieces while the operator was still trying to figure out where the projectile had come from. Her second target was the point man who was leading Morrison's security detail. Sarah dropped from an elevated position directly onto his shoulders, using his own body weight and momentum to drive him to the ground while simultaneously relieving him of his weapons. The movement was so fast and unexpected that the other guards didn't even realize their partner was down until Sarah was already moving toward her next target. The third guard managed to draw his weapon, but Sarah was already inside his effective range, using techniques that turned his own training against him. She grabbed his gun hand and redirected his aim while delivering a precise strike to his solar plexus that left him gasping for air and unable to continue fighting. The fourth and final guard was the most experienced of Morrison's security detail, and he reacted correctly to Sarah's attack by creating distance and drawing his sidearm. But Sarah had anticipated this response and was already moving, using the bulk of the electrical equipment as cover while closing the distance between them. The guard's first shot missed Sarah by inches, the bullet sparking off a metal housing just beside her head. His second shot never came, because Sarah reached him before he could acquire a clear target. A quick series of movements disarmed him and left him unconscious on the ground, joining his teammates in what had become a very embarrassing situation for elite federal operatives. Through it all, Colonel Morrison had stood frozen in shock, watching his handpicked security detail get dismantled by a woman who moved like violence personified. When Sarah finally turned her attention to him, standing perfectly calm among the bodies of his guards, Morrison found himself staring into the eyes of someone who had killed enemies of the state with her bare hands and felt no remorse about it. Sarah spoke quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made colonels forget their rank and remember their mortality. She told Morrison exactly what was going to happen next, how he was going to cooperate with her demands, and what would occur if he chose to be difficult about the situation. Morrison tried to maintain his composure, reminding Sarah of his rank and the consequences of assaulting a federal officer. Sarah listened politely to his threats and warnings, then demonstrated why his rank meant nothing by efficiently restraining him with zip ties that she produced from her tactical gear. With Morrison secured and his security detail neutralized, Sarah began the interrogation that would determine whether Cedar Falls remained peaceful or became a battleground. She needed to understand who had ordered this operation, why her participation in the mysterious mission was so critical, and what kind of threat justified kidnapping a civilian from her quiet life. Morrison initially refused to cooperate, citing national security and chain of command as reasons why he couldn't divulge classified information. Sarah listened to his objections with the patience of someone who had interrogated much more dangerous individuals under far worse conditions. Then, she began explaining what she had learned about human psychology during her years of military service. People, Sarah told Morrison, had breaking points that could be reached without physical torture or illegal coercion. They had fears and weaknesses that could be exploited through psychological pressure and carefully applied leverage. Morrison's weakness, she had determined, was his career and reputation. He was ambitious, politically connected, and terrified of being seen as incompetent by his superiors. Sarah began by describing exactly what would happen to Morrison's career when his superiors learned that he had lost an entire operation to one woman. She explained how the story would spread through military and intelligence circles, how he would become a cautionary tale about underestimating opponents, how his name would be associated with failure and embarrassment. But then, Sarah offered Morrison an alternative. If he cooperated fully with her demands, she would ensure that the story told to his superiors made him look competent and professional. She would claim that he had negotiated brilliantly with a dangerous operative, that he had found a diplomatic solution to a crisis that could have resulted in civilian casualties. Morrison listened to Sarah's offer with growing interest, but he was still reluctant to reveal classified information without proper authorization. Sarah understood his position and respected his loyalty to the chain of command, even while planning to break that loyalty if necessary. The breakthrough came when Sarah revealed exactly how much she already knew about the operation. She repeated conversations she had overheard, described details of the mission that Morrison thought were classified, and demonstrated that she had access to intelligence sources that should have been completely secure. Morrison realized that Sarah wasn't fishing for information. She already knew most of the details and was simply giving him an opportunity to confirm what she had learned through other means. More importantly, she was offering him a way to complete his mission without further bloodshed or embarrassment. The conversation that followed would have shocked Morrison's superiors with its frank discussion of classified operations and political considerations. Sarah learned about the terrorist threat that had prompted her recall, the political pressure being applied to resolve the situation quickly, and, most importantly, the identity of the person who had leaked her location to both the terrorists and the government agencies hunting her. The revelation was like a punch to Sarah's stomach. The leak had come from someone she had trusted completely, someone who knew her real identity and current location because she had shared that information in a moment of vulnerability. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound because it meant that her peaceful life in Cedar Falls had been built on an illusion of safety that had never really existed. But the betrayal also provided Sarah with the leverage she needed to resolve the situation. If she could prove that the leak had come from inside the government, she could expose a security breach that would shift blame away from her and onto the people who had failed to protect classified information. Morrison, sensing that Sarah was emotionally affected by the revelation about the leak, tried to regain control of the situation by reminding her of the terrorist threat that still needed to be addressed. Thousands of innocent lives were at stake, he argued, and her personal feelings couldn't be allowed to override her duty to protect American citizens. Sarah listened to Morrison's arguments with growing anger, not because he was wrong about the threat, but because he was trying to manipulate her sense of duty to achieve political objectives. She had given years of her life to protecting innocent people, had sacrificed her health, her relationships, and ultimately her identity to serve her country. The idea that someone would try to guilt her into further service while simultaneously betraying her trust was infuriating. But as dawn approached over Cedar Falls, Sarah realized that Morrison was right about one thing. There were innocent lives at stake, both in the terrorist threat he had described and in the town that had become her sanctuary. She couldn't save one group by sacrificing another, and she couldn't resolve the situation by running away from it. Sarah made her decision with the same cold calculation that had guided her through the most dangerous missions of her military career. She would deal with the terrorist threat, but on her own terms and with guarantees about her future that Morrison's superiors would be forced to honor. The people of Cedar Falls would be protected, the terrorists would be stopped, and the person who had betrayed her would face consequences for their actions. As the sun rose over the small town that had given her 3 years of peace, Sarah Martinez prepared for one final mission. But this time, she wouldn't be fighting just for her country or her duty. She would be fighting for the right to choose her own destiny and for justice against those who had tried to steal that choice away from her. The terrorist compound was hidden in the mountains of Northern California, a sprawling facility that had once been a survivalist retreat, but now served as headquarters for one of the most dangerous groups the government had ever encountered. Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the compound, studying its defenses through high-powered binoculars while her mind processed tactical possibilities with the precision of a computer. 3 days had passed since her confrontation with Colonel Morrison in Cedar Falls. True to her word, Sarah had agreed to undertake the mission that had prompted the government's desperate attempt to bring her back into service. But she had also extracted guarantees that would protect the people she cared about and ensure that her service would truly be voluntary this time. The terrorist group called itself the American Liberation Front, a name that masked their true agenda of creating chaos and fear through carefully orchestrated attacks on civilian targets. Their leader was Marcus Steele, a former military officer who had been dishonorably discharged after being caught selling weapons to foreign agents. Steele had specifically requested Sarah by name, claiming that he would only negotiate with a legendary Marine combat master. Sarah understood why Steele wanted her involved. Her reputation in special operations circles was both a blessing and a curse. Enemy commanders knew that defeating Captain Sarah Martinez would bring them incredible prestige, while the psychological impact of her presence on a battlefield could demoralize entire units. Steele was gambling that he could capture or kill her in a way that would enhance his own reputation among terrorist networks worldwide. But Steele had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that Sarah would approach this mission with the same methods and mindset that had made her famous during her active military career. He expected her to lead a large assault team, to rely on overwhelming firepower and superior numbers to achieve victory. Instead, Sarah was planning to infiltrate the compound alone, using stealth and psychology to accomplish what an entire battalion might struggle to achieve. The intelligence briefing Sarah had received before departing for California painted a grim picture of the threat Steele's group represented. They had acquired military-grade explosives, automatic weapons, and, worst of all, a shipment of chemical weapons that could kill thousands of people if deployed in a populated area. The government analysts estimated that the group was planning to attack multiple targets simultaneously, creating terror and confusion that would paralyze emergency response systems. Sarah's mission objectives were straightforward, but incredibly dangerous. She needed to neutralize the terrorist threat, recover or destroy the chemical weapons, and capture Marcus Steele alive for interrogation. She also had a personal objective that wasn't part of her official orders. She intended to discover how Steele had learned her real identity and location, information that should have been known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. The compound's defenses were formidable, but predictable. Steele had used his military background to create overlapping fields of fire, multiple layers of security, and backup systems that would make a conventional assault extremely costly. Guard towers provided excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain, motion sensors detected movement along likely approach routes, and thermal imaging cameras could spot intruders even in complete darkness. But every defensive system had weaknesses, and Sarah had spent her career learning to exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision. The compound's strength was also its weakness. Steele had designed his defenses to repel a large assault force, which meant they were less effective against a single infiltrator who understood how military minds worked. Sarah began her approach at sunset, using the changing light conditions to mask her movements as she descended from the cliff toward the compound's perimeter. She had studied the guard rotation schedules for hours, identifying a 14-minute window when thermal cameras would be cycling through their scanning patterns. During that window, a person moving at precisely the right speed could reach the outer fence without being detected. The fence itself was topped with razor wire and connected to motion sensors, but Sarah had encountered similar obstacles dozens of times during her military career. She used a technique that involved creating vibrations that would mask her movements, essentially making the fence ignore her presence while she cut through it with tools designed specifically for this purpose. Once inside the perimeter, Sarah moved through the compound like a ghost, staying in blind spots created by the security systems themselves. Guard towers had excellent visibility, but they also created shadows that could conceal someone who understood how light and darkness interacted with defensive positions. Sarah used these shadows to move from building to building, gathering intelligence about the compound's layout and the location of her primary targets. Her first objective was the communications center, where Steele coordinated with his operatives and maintained contact with other terrorist cells. Sarah needed to understand the full scope of the planned attacks and identify any cells that might proceed with their missions, even if the main compound was neutralized. The communications center was housed in what had originally been the retreat's main lodge, a large building with multiple rooms and several possible entrances. Sarah chose the most difficult approach, entering through a second-story window that required her to scale a wall while remaining invisible to patrolling guards. The difficulty of the approach was precisely why it would be unexpected and therefore less likely to be defended. Inside the communications center, Sarah found evidence that confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the terrorist threat. Multiple teams were positioned in major cities across the country, each equipped with enough chemical weapons to kill hundreds of people. The attacks were scheduled to begin in less than 18 hours, timed to coincide with major public events that would ensure maximum casualties. But Sarah also found something that answered her personal questions about how her identity had been compromised. Among Steele's communications was a file containing detailed information about her civilian life in Cedar Falls, complete with photographs and personal details that could only have come from someone with access to her protected file. The source of the information was identified by a code name that Sarah recognized with growing fury. The betrayal had come from Agent David Harrison, a CIA operative who had worked with Sarah on several joint missions during her active career. Harrison had been one of the few people who knew about her new identity and location, information he had been given in case of emergencies that might require her expertise. Instead, he had sold that information to Marcus Steele for reasons that weren't immediately clear from the communications Sarah had intercepted. Sarah photographed the evidence using a specialized camera that could transmit images directly to secure government servers. She needed to ensure that Harrison's betrayal would be exposed even if something happened to her during the mission. But she also needed to focus on the immediate threat represented by the chemical weapons and the coordinated attacks planned for the following day. Her next objective was the compound's armory, where the chemical weapons were stored along with the conventional explosives and firearms that Steele's group had accumulated. The armory was the most heavily defended building in the compound, surrounded by guards and protected by security systems that would make approach extremely difficult. Sarah spent 2 hours observing the armory and its defenses, looking for patterns in guard movements and weaknesses in security coverage. What she found was a system that was nearly impregnable from the outside, but vulnerable to someone who could approach it from an unexpected direction. The armory had been built into a hillside, with its rear wall actually formed by the natural rock of the mountain itself. Steele's planners had assumed that this made the building impossible to attack from behind, but they hadn't considered someone with Sarah's specialized training in mountain warfare and underground infiltration. Using techniques she had learned during operations in Afghanistan and other mountainous regions, Sarah located a natural cave system that connected to the area behind the armory. The caves were narrow and treacherous, requiring her to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for her shoulders while navigating by touch in absolute darkness. The cave system emerged exactly where Sarah had hoped, in a depression behind the armory that was invisible to the compound's guards and security cameras. From this position, she could approach the building's rear wall and use specialized cutting tools to create an entrance that would bypass all of the facility's defensive systems. Sarah's infiltration of the armory revealed the true scope of the terrorist threat. The chemical weapons were more sophisticated and deadly than the government's intelligence had indicated. Steele's group had enough poison gas to contaminate entire city blocks, and they had developed delivery systems that would maximize casualties while making detection and response extremely difficult. But Sarah also discovered something that would change the nature of her mission. The chemical weapons weren't just intended for terrorist attacks. They were part of a larger operation designed to justify increased government surveillance and restrictions on civil liberties. Steele wasn't just a terrorist. He was working with corrupt government officials who intended to use the attacks as justification for policies that the American people would never accept under normal circumstances. The revelation explained why Harrison had betrayed Sarah's location. He wasn't just selling information to terrorists. He was part of a conspiracy that was using terrorism as a tool to achieve political objectives. Sarah's involvement in stopping the attacks would legitimize the government's response and provide cover for the real architects of the conspiracy. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. She could complete her original mission by destroying the chemical weapons and neutralizing Steele's group, but doing so would help cover up the conspiracy that had orchestrated the entire situation. Alternatively, she could expose the conspiracy by allowing the attacks to proceed, but that would result in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. The decision Sarah made reflected the principles that had guided her throughout her military career. She would protect innocent lives regardless of the political consequences, but she would also ensure that the truth about the conspiracy was revealed. The solution required her to completely abandon her original mission plan and attempt something far more dangerous and complex. Instead of simply destroying the chemical weapons, Sarah began carefully documenting their specifications and origin. She needed evidence that would prove the weapons had been acquired through government channels, evidence that would implicate the conspiracy in the planned attacks. The work was painstaking and dangerous, requiring her to remain in the armory much longer than her original timeline allowed. While Sarah worked to gather evidence, the compound around her began showing signs of increased activity. Guards were changing their patterns, communications traffic was increasing, and there were signs that Steele himself was moving around the facility more frequently. Sarah realized that her presence might have been detected, or that the terrorists were simply making final preparations for their planned attacks. Sarah's situation became critical when she heard footsteps approaching the armory. Multiple guards were conducting a security sweep that would inevitably discover the entrance she had created in the rear wall. She had minutes to complete her documentation work and escape before being trapped inside the most heavily defended building in the compound. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah finished photographing the evidence she needed while simultaneously preparing the chemical weapons for destruction. She couldn't allow the weapons to fall into anyone's hands, even if destroying them would help cover up the conspiracy that had created the entire situation. Sarah's escape from the armory required her to use every technique she had learned during her years of special operations training. She moved through the building like smoke, avoiding guards and security systems while carrying enough explosives to level the entire structure. Her route took her through corridors lined with enough firepower to equip a small army, past rooms where terrorists were making final preparations for attacks that would never happen. The explosion that destroyed the armory was visible for miles, a pillar of fire that rose into the night sky and announced to everyone in the compound that their mission had failed. But Sarah was already moving toward her final objective, the building where Marcus Steele was coordinating what remained of his operation. Steele's command center was in chaos when Sarah arrived. The destruction of the armory had eliminated their primary weapons and thrown their entire operation into confusion. Guards were running in all directions, communication systems were overloaded with conflicting orders, and Steele himself was screaming at his subordinates to maintain discipline and execute their backup plans. Sarah entered the command center through a skylight that Steele's security planners had dismissed as too difficult to access. She dropped into the room like an avenging angel, landing among the terrorists with weapons already drawn and every movement calculated for maximum psychological impact. The reaction was exactly what Sarah had expected. Steele's men, already demoralized by the destruction of their armory, froze when they found themselves facing the legendary Marine combat master. Some reached for weapons they would never have time to draw. Others simply raised their hands in surrender, understanding that resistance would be both futile and fatal. Steele himself stood behind his desk, staring at Sarah with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. He had known this moment would come, had planned for it, and dreaded it in equal measure. The man who had thought he could use Sarah's reputation to enhance his own legacy now faced the reality of what that reputation actually meant. The conversation between Sarah and Steele would later be analyzed by psychologists and military strategists as a perfect example of how superior training and mental preparation could overcome numerical disadvantages. Sarah didn't need to threaten or intimidate Steele. She simply explained what was going to happen next, how he would cooperate with her demands, and what the consequences would be if he chose to be difficult. Steele's surrender was both inevitable and complete. Faced with the destruction of his operation and the presence of an opponent he couldn't hope to defeat, he provided Sarah with everything she needed to unravel the conspiracy that had created the entire situation. The information would lead to arrests and prosecutions that would reach the highest levels of government and intelligence agencies. As dawn broke over the California mountains, Sarah Martinez stood among the ruins of what had been planned as one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in American history. She had succeeded in protecting innocent lives, exposing government corruption, and completing what would be her final mission as a Marine combat master. But her work wasn't finished yet. There were still people who needed to face justice for their crimes, and Sarah intended to ensure that justice was served. 6 months after the destruction of the terrorist compound in California, Sarah Martinez stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., watching as Agent David Harrison was led away in handcuffs. The man who had betrayed her location and nearly caused the deaths of thousands of innocent people had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, Sarah reflected, sometimes took time, but it was always worth waiting for. The trial had been a sensation in intelligence circles, though most of the details remained classified from public view. Harrison's conviction on charges of treason, conspiracy, and terrorism had sent shockwaves through the CIA and other government agencies. The conspiracy he had been part of reached higher than anyone had initially suspected, involving senators, defense contractors, and intelligence officials who had planned to use terrorist attacks as justification for unprecedented surveillance powers. Sarah's testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Her evidence, gathered during the infiltration of Steele's compound, had provided irrefutable proof of the conspiracy's scope and objectives. More importantly, her credibility as a decorated Marine combat master had given weight to accusations that might otherwise have been dismissed as paranoid fantasies. The aftermath of the trial had brought Sarah a different kind of recognition than she had received during her military career. Instead of being known only within special operations circles, she became a symbol of integrity and courage for people who believed that government should serve the citizens rather than using them as pawns in political games. Several publishers had approached her about writing a book, and documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story to a wider audience. But Sarah had declined all offers to capitalize on her newfound fame. She had never fought for recognition or financial reward, and she wasn't about to start now that her service to the country was finally ending. Instead, she had quietly returned to the life she had built in Cedar Falls, hoping to rebuild what had been damaged during the federal operation that had torn her away from her peaceful existence. The return to Cedar Falls had been both heartwarming and bittersweet. The town's residents had welcomed her back with a mixture of pride and amazement, finally understanding why federal agents had been so interested in their quiet librarian. Children who had gathered around her during story time now looked at her with awe, knowing that the gentle woman who had taught them to love books was also a hero who had saved countless lives. Tom Bradley had been waiting for her when she returned, standing in the library where they had first met and holding a bouquet of flowers that he had picked from his own garden. Their reunion had been tender and complicated, filled with conversations about secrets and trust, about the difference between the person Sarah had been and the woman she wanted to become. Tom had struggled with learning about Sarah's real identity, not because he feared her capabilities, but because he wondered whether she had ever truly trusted him during the relationship. Sarah had spent hours explaining that her secrecy hadn't been about a lack of trust, but about a desire to protect both him and the peaceful life they had been building together. The relationship had survived those difficult conversations, growing stronger as they learned to build their future on complete honesty rather than carefully constructed omissions. Tom had proposed to Sarah on the anniversary of her return to Cedar Falls, offering her a simple ring and a promise that their life together would be as peaceful or as adventurous as she wanted it to be. Sarah's work at the library had taken on new dimensions after her return. Children still gathered around her for story time, but now she also worked with teenagers who were interested in military careers, sharing insights about service and sacrifice that couldn't be found in any recruitment brochure. She had also started a reading program for veterans, understanding that many former soldiers struggled with the transition to civilian life just as she had. The federal government had approached Sarah several times about returning to active duty or accepting consulting positions that would utilize her unique skills and experience. Each offer had been politely, but firmly declined. Sarah had given enough of her life to military service, and she was determined to spend her remaining years building rather than destroying, nurturing rather than eliminating threats. But Sarah's rejection of government service didn't mean she had abandoned her commitment to protecting innocent people. She had quietly established a foundation that provided support for victims of terrorism and their families, using the expertise she had gained during her military career to help people rebuild their lives after experiencing unimaginable trauma. The foundation also funded research into preventing radicalization and identifying potential threats before they could develop into active terrorist cells. Sarah understood that the best way to protect people wasn't through superior firepower, but through education, economic opportunity, and social programs that address the root causes of extremism. Marcus Steele, the terrorist leader Sarah had captured during her final mission, had become an unexpected source of intelligence about other extremist groups. His cooperation with federal investigators had been motivated partly by fear and partly by genuine remorse for the lives that would have been lost if his planned attacks had succeeded. The information he provided had prevented several other terrorist plots and led to the arrest of dozens of individuals who had been planning attacks on civilian targets. Steele's transformation from terrorist leader to government informant had been facilitated by Sarah herself, who had visited him in federal prison to discuss his motivations and the factors that had led him to embrace extremist ideology. Their conversations had been part of a broader effort to understand how military veterans could be prevented from turning their skills against the country they had once served. Colonel Morrison, the man who had led the operation to capture Sarah in Cedar Falls, had survived the political fallout from the conspiracy trials, but had seen his career effectively ended. He had been transferred to a desk job in a remote location, where his primary responsibility was reviewing requisition forms for office supplies. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, who had always believed that arrogance was more dangerous than incompetence in military leadership. Morrison had written Sarah a letter of apology 6 months after the conclusion of the trials, acknowledging that he had underestimated both her capabilities and her integrity. Sarah had responded with a brief note accepting his apology and wishing him well in his future endeavors. She bore no grudges against people who had simply been following orders, even when those orders had disrupted her peaceful life. The town of Cedar Falls had benefited significantly from the attention generated by Sarah's story. Tourism had increased as people came to see where the famous Marine combat master had chosen to make her home. The library had received donations from around the country, allowing them to expand their programs and modernize their facilities. Sarah had been offered the position of head librarian, but she had declined, preferring to remain in her original role where she could work directly with patrons rather than administrative paperwork. Sarah's story had also inspired other veterans to speak out about their experiences and the challenges they faced in transitioning to civilian life. A national movement had developed around the idea that military skills could be redirected toward positive civilian purposes, with veterans becoming teachers, counselors, and community leaders rather than struggling in isolation. Several military academies had invited Sarah to speak to their students about the realities of special operations and the psychological challenges of combat. Her speeches focused not on the excitement or glory of military service, but on the responsibility that came with the power to take lives and the importance of never losing sight of the human cost of warfare. Sarah had also become involved in efforts to improve the military's approach to mental health and trauma recovery. Too many veterans were struggling with post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts because they hadn't received adequate support during their transition to civilian life. Sarah's foundation funded research into innovative treatment approaches and provided direct assistance to veterans who were in crisis. The wedding of Sarah Martinez and Tom Bradley took place on a beautiful spring day in the Cedar Falls Town Park, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become family during Sarah's years in the community. The ceremony was simple and elegant, reflecting both their personalities and their shared commitment to building a quiet, peaceful life together. Sarah wore a simple white dress rather than a military uniform, symbolizing her complete transition from soldier to civilian. The only indication of her military background was a small pin on her bouquet, a decoration that had belonged to her grandfather, who had served in World War II and inspired her own commitment to service. Tom's vows included a promise to support Sarah's foundation work and her commitment to helping other veterans find peace in civilian life. Sarah's vows included a promise to leave the past behind and focus on building their future together, while never forgetting the lesson she had learned about the importance of protecting the innocent and standing up for what was right. The reception was held at the library, with tables set up among the stacks where Sarah had spent so many peaceful hours. Children from the community performed a reading of poems they had written about courage and friendship, while veterans who had benefited from Sarah's foundation shared stories about how her work had helped them rebuild their lives. As the evening progressed and guests began to leave, Sarah found herself standing in the children's section of the library, surrounded by the books she had read to countless young minds over the years. Tom joined her there, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder as they looked at the colorful displays and cozy reading nooks. Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a young woman eager to serve her country, had become a warrior capable of incredible violence, and had finally found peace as a librarian in a small town that valued kindness over strength. Each phase of her life had taught her important lessons about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of courage. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities that didn't involve weapons or warfare. Sarah and Tom planned to expand their family, perhaps adopting children who needed loving homes. Sarah's foundation would continue to grow, helping more veterans and terrorism victims rebuild their lives. The library would remain a sanctuary for learning and growth, a place where children could discover the magic of books and the power of imagination. But Sarah also knew that her skills and experience would always be part of who she was. If another crisis threatened innocent lives, if the country needed her expertise to prevent catastrophe, she would answer that call one more time. The Marine Combat Master might have retired, but the commitment to protect others would never fade. As she stood in the library that had become her sanctuary, surrounded by books and love and the promise of peaceful tomorrows, Sarah Martinez finally understood what victory really meant. It wasn't about defeating enemies or completing impossible missions. It was about creating a world where children could read stories without fear, where communities could thrive without violence, and where heroes could choose to hang up their weapons and become librarians. The quiet life she had dreamed of was finally within her grasp, and this time, no one could take it away from her. Sarah Martinez, Marine Combat Master, had fought her last battle and won her greatest victory. The war was over, and peace had come at last.